Oh, this is the inaugural. I didn't know that.
This leadership series has been generously established by a UND alumnus, Paul Forrest. I'd like to welcome our provost, Tom DiLorenzo, is here to support our efforts. And this symposium has been established to give us the opportunity to invite world-renowned economists to come to speak to UND, students, faculty, alumni, policymakers, and other community members on emerging topics concerning public policy and national discourse. We are so proud and excited to welcome our featured inaugural speaker, Professor Bob Hall. Dr. Hall is joining us today from Stanford University and brings enormous prestige to the symposium as one of the top macroeconomists in the world. He earned his PhD in economics from MIT, as well as a bachelor's in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Hall is currently the Robert and Carol McNeil Joint Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and Professor of Economics at Stanford University. He has served as past president of the American Economic Association, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a distinguished fellow of the AEA, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, and the Society of Labor Economists. As if that's already not impressive enough, in addition, Professor Hall was director of the research program on economic fluctuations and growth of the National Bureau of Economic Research from 1977 through 2013. Further, he has published extensively in the leading academic journals in this field. At the College of Business and Public Administration at UND, we support high-quality, impactful research in our fields. As an academic, this is the core of who we are and what we do. Research, such as what Dr. Hall will be presenting today, impacts all of us associated with the university. Whether it is informing the classroom curriculum, creating experiential opportunities for our students, or servicing our state in making public policy decisions. Leading research of this type is critical to our mission as an institution of higher learning. Experts in our field, such as Professor Hall, only highlight these critical efforts. And we are thrilled to have him here to share his expertise with us today. At this time, it is my pleasure to invite Professor Hall to the stage to share his research presentation with us entitled, "The Bad News About Stagnant Wages and How to Improve Wage Growth." Please join me in welcoming Professor Hall.
Well, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I've been visiting Grand Forks from time to time since 1977. Watched my sister's family grow up and enlarge itself. Always enjoyed it, except perhaps the one time when I came here in the winter and it was 35 degrees below zero. But anyway, it is a great pleasure and honor to give this talk. So I'm going to talk about two closely related subjects. First of all, I'm going to talk about what's happened in the U.S. economy from the perspective of the average job holder, or actually the average member of the population, most of whom are holding jobs, and focusing on recent decades. And then that sets the stage for asking, having seen some of the reasons that the purchasing power of earnings have not kept up to previous growth levels, to see what could be done by way of policy that could restore something like past levels of the purchasing power of earnings. So I'm going to focus on a particular measure which economists call real. Real means the purchasing power. So it's your earnings go up partly as an illusion because there's always a certain amount of inflation, typically recently around 2%. So 2% is kind of a benchmark for dollar earnings. We get rid of that by dividing by the cost of living. So what you're going to see here doesn't require any further adjustment for inflation. It's been adjusted for inflation. And it's stated as earnings per member of the population, not per worker. So it's not, it also takes account of the fact that there's change over time in different directions with respect to how much earning power there is to support the entire population. So the basic idea of this research is to understand better how there are changes, have been changes over time, and could be changes in the future with improved policy in the amount of purchasing power that the economy generates through the efforts of the working population. So it's not per worker. And it includes things like changes in the size of the labor force relative to the population, and it takes account of the fact that if unemployment is high, as it was starting about 10 years ago, that reduces the amount of earnings that come from a work effort. So it's a more general thing than just looking at hourly wages, but of course hourly wages are also included in this. And I'm going to do it before taxes and transfers. So this is specifically about what workers contribute to the economy. The contributions of workers to it are then taxed. So one of the things that your earnings support is the expenses of the government. And I'm not talking about transfers that people receive, like unemployment compensation or other benefit programs. This is talking about what workers contribute to the purchasing power that's available for various purposes in the economy. So one great thing is that a friend of mine, John Fernald, has prepared a body of data that anyone can download from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank's website. So if you're interested in doing this yourself, you can either ask me, which I'd be happy to email you a copy of all the calculations I'm going to talk about today, but also you can keep up to date from the San Francisco Fed's website by looking at the Fernald. So you just Google Fernald spreadsheet. It'll take you right to the kind of data that I'm using here. Of course, it all comes from the federal government's statistical agencies, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the two agencies in the US that keep track of data. All right, so what are we talking about? We're talking about real earnings per member of the population. So we go to the Fernald spreadsheet, find out how much real earnings are. So we take dollar earnings, divide by the price level to get rid of inflation's effect, look at real earnings, and then divide by the total population. So that's what we want to talk about. And then what I'm going to do is break that down, because it's very useful to use some ideas that come from economic analysis to break that down into two things. One is the total amount of output, real output, so that's that thing on the right-hand side, and the share of that goes to workers. So there's a major division that takes place in the operation of the economy between the income that goes to workers and the income that goes to owners of capital and land and things like that. So that's one big division that results in some part of output being assigned as earnings to workers. Okay, then I'm going to break real income into productivity per unit of labor input and the volume of labor input. So that's just another. So you'll see a lot of these things. There's something per something else, and then you multiply that by the amount of something else, in this case, labor input, and that is illuminating if you pick the right variables, which I hope I have. So we're going to look at productivity, and by the way, productivity is going to be the most important part of this whole story. When productivity is rising rapidly, it increases the amount of benefit we get from each unit of labor input, and then we pump that through the labor share, and that takes us to real earnings. So we're on our way now to coming up with some variables which we can measure separately And then we know when we multiply them all together that it'll come out to real earnings per member of the population. Okay, so productivity is the ratio of output to quality adjusted hours of work. That's just the definition. And the denominator of this, quality adjusted total hours, is the basic measure that economists use of the volume of labor input. So that's another step. And again, that's productivity is the fact that productivity grew rapidly at some times and is currently not growing very rapidly is just a key factor in the way this is going to unfold. Okay, so that gives a way of breaking down all the variables we're talking about here. So we start with hours per worker. So that's the amount of time that each worker is putting in. We multiply by the quality of hours. The quality of hours is so how much a worker produces. It's the most important variable that determines that across workers is education. So education enhances the quality of work, and that is more educated people get more done. And there's a whole branch of macroeconomics that deals with that. But here we're just going to measure it, and we're going to follow Fernald's measures of it. We're going to look at workers per member of the labor force, and members of the labor force per working age person, and working age people as a fraction of the total population. So there's going to be a story. So this is a series of narratives about what's happened in the U.S. economy and what could happen in the future, broken down by this way, which is a way that the macroeconomists tend to look at these. All right, so then just to lay this whole thing out, 1 through 7, 7-way. So we have labor productivity. That's going to turn out to be the thing that varies the most. Labor share, which has also recently been declining. It's an important part of the story of what's happened recently. Hours per worker. The employment rate. Usually you talk about unemployment. In order to make all these things good instead of bad, everything on this list is good if it gets bigger, but not unemployment. It's bad if that gets bigger. So it turned out to the employment rate. So it's 1 minus the unemployment rate. It's the fraction of the labor force who are employed. Normally we talk about the fraction unemployed, but the other piece of that fraction, 1 minus that, are employed. And then the ratio of the labor force to the population, that's again something that's had some interesting movement. And the fraction of the population who are age 16 plus, the working age population, to the population of all ages. That turns out not to be too important. The big ones on this list are labor productivity, the labor share, and the ratio of the labor force to the population. But to make it complete, I will comment somewhat. So now we're going to look at pictures, more interesting than lists. So first of all, so here's the story. This is what this research is all about. And it's quite striking. So if you look at this, you can see that we had quite rapid growth of real earnings per member of the population periodically. See, I don't know if, does this actually show? No, good luck. So I just have to describe this. I can't use the laser, but you see it goes down every now and then. For example, right at the beginning, it went down in 1981-82. So that was a recession. And that was actually, it was the biggest recession of the time since we started collecting data in 1948. There was a less important recession you can see in 1990-91. There was the so-called tech recession in 2000. And then there was a Great Recession, which is the last decline here. Actually, I thought I could, I guess, here. Okay, so that's the Great Recession. And you can see that in terms of recessions, that was by far the worst. It merits this term, the Great Recession. But notice that in the years from 2000 until the Great Recession, this curve was much flatter. So when I talk about the bad news, it's the flatness that began in 2000. We had this sharp contraction, big contraction in the Great Recession, which started basically 10 years ago. And then we've had growth. We've had quite rapid growth since then, since about the beginning of 2010, back up to a growth path. If you can imagine a dotted line that starts in 2000 and goes across, we're practically back up to that dotted line. But the growth since 2000 has been very inferior to growth before that, especially the rapid growth in the 1990s. It's as if something terrible happened in the year 2000. I wouldn't suggest that it was the election of George Bush, but that did happen that year. But since that year, the growth, remember what this is. This is what the efforts of workers have contributed to producing output. It's the resources that the work effort of individuals is available to the government through taxation, to themselves to consume, to invest. And the growth of that just discontinuously stopped in the year 2000. And you know, when I first started becoming aware of this and just how sharp this it's just like almost a right angle of rapid growth followed by a very inferior growth. This has been very much in my mind. It seems to me that this is a lot of things that are going on in the U.S. in terms of pessimism. This has definitely been accompanied by pessimism of working people, and it's not surprising compared to the very rapid growth that occurred. Even if you went back to earlier years than 1980, you'd see pretty rapid growth. This complete failure to grow, other than the recovery from the Great Recession, is really troublesome. So this is what we want to delve into. All right, so first of all, productivity. So productivity, remember, is the amount of output that 1 hour of work produces. And productivity, as you can see, it actually continued to grow a little bit after that turnaround year of 2000. And it grew a little bit right after the Great Recession. It's been very flat since then. So the economy has not been rewarding work with anything like the same growth rate. It's been essentially flat since the end of the recovery. So it's over the last 7 years or so. And there's been no sign. You can see, if anything, in the most recent year, productivity growth was even lower than ever, practically zero. So this is, in some respects, so as you'll see when we try to break these things down, this is the single most important thing for you to know, is that for some reason, and macroeconomists differ a great deal on this, I don't have a good answer myself, but for some reason, the ability of the economy to turn an hour of work into more and more output, which was pretty reliable, except in recessions over the previous 2 decades, has just been very, very disappointing recently. So keep that in mind. Another remarkable thing that's happened, and again, this started right at 2000, it's actually the main reason why there was such a sharp reversal starting in 2000, is that the labor share of income, which was pretty stable at right around 2/3. So workers were getting 2/3 of income, sharing in 2/3 of the growth of the economy. And then, surprisingly, generally since then, except in the last couple of years, it's been reversed, but we're still far below. We're about 3 percentage points below, and that's a lot of money. That's a very significant shift away from labor and toward the owners of capital that's occurred since then, since 2000. And again, remember, that's right at 2000. There's been a lot of commentary and a lot of ideas about why this shift has occurred. The most successful one, and the one that I've been working on recently, is that this shift coincides at least with a increase in the market power and monopoly power of businesses. Over this period, we've seen The biggest businesses in many markets, about half of all markets in the U.S., we've seen a considerable increase in the importance of a dominant firm in an industry. So that appears at least to be part of the story, but perhaps not all the story. And it's going to take a while. There's been many, many, many papers written on this, but none of them I found very convincing. But it's another factor. And you can see that there has been some relief recently. This downward trend ended about 3 or 4 years ago. It's been replaced by some increases since then. So there's a ray of hope, at least that process has stopped and at least stabilized and maybe reversed some of the problematical shift away from labor. Hours per employed person is something that's been stable, and actually it declined for a while, but it's been rising recently. So this is, you can think of this as basically hours per work week, and that averages just under 40 hours across the labor force. So that's one thing that has not happened, and especially not recently. You can see that there was a peak of hours. The period just before 2000 was quite remarkable. It seems like we're moving back into a similar period when unemployment is extremely low. By some measures, the labor market now is tighter than it's ever been. It's easier to find jobs now than it's ever been since 1948. Just amazing. And that was also true. The previous time when this was true was in 2000. I've always remembered that the unemployment rate in Minneapolis, I guess it's probably the nearest big metropolitan area to here, in the year 1999 was 0.9%. This is really amazing. You can run a capitalist economy essentially without unemployment. I've always found that to be a really exciting fact. And today, nationally, we have only 3.89% in that range unemployment, which is really historically very low. And it's accompanied by some other similarly good numbers. It's very easy to find a job. The flip side of that, of course, is it's hard for employers to find workers, but that's a good thing. And you can see that with this increase in hours. So we haven't quite gotten back to the very tight labor market, very good labor market of the year 2000, but it seems like we're getting there. Every number that's come in recently in the last 3 or 4 years has been very good. Don't undersell the performance of the U.S. labor market in this respect. We're not wasting people's time with unemployment these days. Labor quality is a nice flat line that rises gradually. There's not a crisis. It's the one thing that's as unambiguously a contributor to extra growth. Unfortunately, it's not very large. It mainly reflects the fact that workers retiring today have very significantly less employment than those entering the labor force. The two flows are about the same, and the labor force is not growing very fast, but we're replacing less educated workers with more educated workers, and that's a plus. But it's not very big. One of the things that obviously would be desirable would be to increase this number even more. Okay, so I've already pretty much said what there is to say about unemployment. Unemployment is one of the most remarkably stable things as time goes by. In 1948, the unemployment rate was about the same as it is today. There isn't a trend upward, there's not a trend downward. We basically have a very stable labor market. You can see that the employment rate, 1 minus the unemployment rate, went down a lot. That is, unemployment shot up 10 years ago. It recovered pretty well, pretty much on normal track. And so we don't have a problem of growing shortage of jobs. There's an unfortunate tendency for the public and reporters in particular to adopt a jobs calculus, which says every time some manufacturer, Harley, decides to build motorcycles in Mexico, that those are, quote, lost jobs. But that's not true at all, because everyone can find a job. There is no jobs calculus. The the U.S. economy is terrific at generating jobs. So you should just disregard anyone who ever says, well, at some point in North Carolina, the furniture industry has lost jobs. Well, that doesn't mean that number of people are now unemployed, because the U.S., one thing we can do is generate jobs for people. They may not be great jobs. They may not, certainly the earnings from those jobs has not risen very rapidly, but unlike many European economies, we don't have a jobs problem. We have other problems. We have quality of jobs problems, but we don't have a numerical problem with jobs. And that sets the U.S. economy apart from almost all other advanced economies who do have a jobs problem. The ratio of the labor force to the population age 16 plus is what's called the labor force participation rate. And you can see it's something that went up until what year? 2000. Okay, so in the year 2000, there was a turnaround in participation, and it began to decline. It declined a little more than usually rapidly during the Great Recession, and it's bounced back a little since then. You can see that it's been flat instead of declining recently. But there is a problem, not for most members of the labor force or the population, but in particular, some groups of younger workers, men more than women, and higher income more than lower income. We've seen this decline in labor force participation. In particular, the fraction of teenagers who are active in the labor force, that is either working or looking for work, has gone way down. As a rule of thumb, it used to be the case that, let's say 80% of teenagers were employed or looking for work, and now it's about 40%. It's really been a major change. And in some ways that's good. For one thing, they're going to school more, so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's definitely a factor. And in some cases, especially 21-year-old men, it's surprising how many of them are not working, not in school, not doing anything useful. There's a great shadow of suspicion that they're in the basement playing video games. And papers have been written that try to make that claim. But anyway, it's a fact that matters in terms of the population. And finally, almost the most boring thing of all is the fraction of the population age 16 plus. It's there just to make it clear that that's not a particularly adverse force. We're seeing some gradual changes because current birth rates are lower than historical levels, but it's a very slow process that really doesn't contribute. So luckily, there's some things you can cross off the list here. Okay, so let me go back. I showed you this before. This is real earnings per member of the overall population. And now you've seen how that breaks down. And again, the major ones are productivity, labor force participation, and the share. So let me just remind you that was productivity. And if you take all the contributions of factors other than productivity, and so participation and the declining share are going to be the big ones here, then again you see that they're responsible. Productivity was not one of those things that turned sharply to the right in 2000, but the others, especially the share, combine to have this. So this is the set of adverse factors that were concentrated and changing in 2000. And it's really quite a surprising development, almost completely unanticipated by scholars of the labor market. All right, so just to summarize, the first half of, it's more than half, but the first topic. So low productivity growth is number one, decline in labor share is number two, decline in labor force relative to population is number three. And all this is occurring in spite of the fact that over the last 10 years, the economy has spectacularly recovered from a very deep recession and is at a very low unemployment rate today. So you can't, one thing you can't blame all these things on is lack of jobs. That tells you a lot about what policy ought to be. So we shouldn't focus on creating jobs. We should focus on creating more competent, capable workers and equipping them with more capital and that type of change. But just the sheer number of jobs in the economy, which is well indicated by the unemployment rate, is not the problem. So if anyone says we need a big infrastructure program to create more jobs, they don't know what's going on in this economy. I mean, unfortunately, there's some people in Washington, D.C., who seem to think that it's still a jobs calculus issue, but it's not. So we can talk about the other topic, which is policy reform to raise earnings. So cutting taxes on capital, that's always attacked as giving money to the rich. But there's another way of looking at it, and that's really important, and that is a tax on capital is a tax on the plant and equipment that empowers labor, makes labor more productive. So if our number one problem is that there's been a diminished growth of productivity, practically down to no growth of productivity, then we ought to be thinking about ways of changing the amount of plant and equipment to make workers more productive. And that seems pretty elementary. And capital is what makes workers more productive. It's the one thing, we don't really know how to change productivity in the fundamental sense of, getting more good things invented. But we do know that reliably that providing more capital is going to make workers more productive. So I'll talk about that. Another thing that's emphasized, although it's more nebulous, and I'm not so sure about it, is the idea of improving, and I'm important to say improving regulation. That doesn't mean getting rid of all regulations. It means deciding which ones are good and which ones are bad, and there's a great mixture. And the other is there's been a lot of emphasis recently on the idea that there's uncertainty, rising uncertainty in the economy, especially about policy. Okay, well, I'm going to concentrate on the cutting taxes on capital because that's something we can do. We sort of know how to do that. We did it in 2017, a little less than a year ago. So although many people think that regulations call for review and policy uncertainty should be reduced, and of course I agree, I'm going to talk about capital. Just to give a sense of what has happened in capital, here's a picture just since 2000 in capital per worker. And you can see that capital per worker grew pretty well through the beginning of the Great Recession. It actually went up. Why did it go up? Because there were fewer workers. The denominator in the ratio declined because of unemployment. So that was okay, but that demonstrates that what does matter is the amount of capital per worker, and if there are fewer workers, that's the wrong way to get more capital per worker, but it does demonstrate that capital per worker matters. Then, after the restoration of full employment, you can see that capital per worker has actually been declining recently. So there's a growing shortfall of capital per worker. Plant and equipment type investment, and by the way, that includes things like software. It's not, I say plant and equipment, but I guess I should say plant equipment and intellectual property inputs like software, which are now included in these numbers. So we have kind of a disaster of capital per worker. So shouldn't we attack that problem head on? Well, that sounds to me like a good idea. if you look at the cost of capital, and I don't have time to go through it, but this is from standard ideas of finance, the cost of capital rose, and it's been high lately. So there's two things that fit together here. That is, business is not installing capital, and they're behaving as if the cost of capital were higher. So we can attack this problem by cutting the cost of capital, and we can do that by cutting taxes on capital. Okay, so, but now it turns out that this is a more complicated issue. And I think a lot of people oversell. Who are thinking along these lines. Part company, I want to show you what growth theory says would happen if we had a major reform, building on the reform of a year ago, using the kind of modeling techniques that are appropriate. So I've emphasized that the Keynesian analysis of this is we need to get the economy going again by creating more jobs. That's done. We did that. There's no longer any merit in that left. So we can't talk about the so-called Keynesian policies because we've pushed them hard. We've had large budget deficits, for example. So we're done with that. We've gotten what we can out of it, and it's clearly not enough. So we need to apply longer run ideas in growth theory, especially stimulated capital formation. Okay, so I want to tell you about, there's only one economist, I mentioned Keynes, two economists. The second economist, my PhD advisor, but widely recognized to be a major contributor. So he proved a theorem, a principle that is absolutely essential, and that is that inherently limited. They can't cause the economy reform. Say, oh, it's going to add 3% to growth every year for now to infinity. That's impossible. That's what my thesis advisor showed. Earned the Nobel Prize for it. Okay, so all we can do is push up the growth path. Okay, so currently the capital tax in the U.S. is in the 20 to 30% range, and let's lower it to 13%. So I've done some calculations that suggest that that might be about the right. It's not zero, but it's quite a bit lower than it is today. So let's do that, and let's just take an example that's really big. Suppose that the tax rate on capital were 70%, and that's kind of an extreme. I just want to do something extreme so you can see how this works. It's not a forecast or anything. And so we're gonna keep getting the same amount of tax. We're gonna raise the amount of tax on people's earnings and lower the rate of tax on capital. That sounds perverse, but remember we have this trove of value that we can create by cutting taxes on capital, getting more capital, and then raising earnings. So we'll do that. Okay, so first of all, this is what happens to GDP growth, or the level of GDP, relative to what it would have been otherwise. It starts shooting up, but then Solo's conclusion applies, and eventually it's at a higher level, but it's on the same growth path. So you'll see that other variables do other things, but GDP does exactly what Solo would say. So what happens to the wage rate? Does the wage rate zoom up right away? I wish, but that's not what happens. And why does that not happen? Because the economy gets energized, and the initial thing that happens is that people work harder, like for example, hours of work could go up, and that's going to depress the wage. A lot of this depends on patience. These policies will generate good things as time goes by, but they involve a certain amount of investment. So, the resources necessary to equip the labor force don't come for free. They come actually from people's work. So they work harder, and that drives down the wage rate. It's a very strong principle, I mentioned this earlier, that if more people are working, it's going to depress the wage rate. Because I showed you that the wage rate and productivity rose when people stopped working because of the recession. Take that principle in reverse, And there it is. So the wage rate initially declines below where it was, which was 100. And then it expands, and solo style, again, it's at a higher level forever, but it doesn't grow fast forever. It just moves up to another higher level. But that's a good deal for workers and everybody, because although they have a short-term sacrifice, there's a permanent long-run benefit from having lower tax rates. If you look at what happens to employment, this energizes people in the short run because they're going to want to take advantage of this opportunity to build more capital, and then that work goes back to its normal level. So they don't have to work harder. They get a permanent benefit without working harder, but they have to do that by building capital, and that requires a short period of more active work. And here's the index of the capital stock. It too rises rapidly at first, and it too flattens out. Everything here is subject to Solo's observation that you can't affect growth rates in the long run. You can only affect levels. And so I think this is the first written analysis that's absolutely completely faithful to the Solo principle. If you ask, well, consumption is ultimately what the economy is intended to deliver, you see the same thing, a short-term period of sacrifice, not a great deal, and then movement to higher levels of consumption, but higher levels, not higher growth rates in the future, but substantial, 20% more. So this comes out of a model, a pretty simple model, but one that is in touch with the right principles of how the economy works when it's at full employment. So there's no Keynesian payoff left here. We start from full employment, we remain at full employment. To get more output, people have to work harder. There's no free reduction in unemployment, for example. But it's a good deal in the longer run. But it is so typical of life, which is that you have a short-run sacrifice in exchange for a substantial long-run benefit. Okay, so I like that. I think we ought to do that. I've not had much success in selling these ideas to the public, or especially in Washington, D.C. But I still want to carry this banner. One last thing, somewhat of a change in subject, but it's irresistible to do this. The U.S. government may not last much longer. It's in a fiscal death spiral, and that's because it's doing something that it's never done before in history, where we have essentially peacetime, we have absolutely full employment, everything's going along fine. This is the time when government ought to be preparing for the next bad period, like a recession, and buying down the debt so that there is room to borrow in the future. Never before has the U.S. government done anything like what it's done in the last few years. And this is not just something that happened recently with the election of Trump. This is something that's been going on for a while. And for a while it was okay because we were in the thralls of a bad recession, but that's not true anymore. There's no excuse for having a 6% deficit, which is what we currently have. We should have a several percentage point surplus so that we can fund a deficit the next time things go bad. The viability of government, we are in danger of the bond market saying, sorry, we're closing as far as the U.S. government's concerned because we don't think you can pay back. Now, we're not at that point now, but we've moved an awful lot in that direction. We have much more headroom to deal with adverse developments than we have had historically. It's absolutely unprecedented to be doing what the U.S. government's doing today. Every previous time when we've had peacetime and full employment, we've had a budget surplus. There's no excuse for what's going on, having a huge deficit today. The weird thing about this is that theorists of democracy said, well, democracy will never work because the voters will vote for low taxes and high spending, and then the government will fall apart. So we went for, 230 years where the American democracy defied that principle. And then starting when? Actually, 2001. It was right after 9/11. Fiscal discipline just disappeared. And it's just not reoccurred since then. It's been true under Democrats, under Republicans. It's just, so the democracy theorists were right. They were just 230 years early. It seems like democracy doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work anymore because people want high government spending and low taxes, and that just doesn't work. And the bond market is going to clang closed, not in the next 10 years, but maybe 10 years after that. So all these counsels of perfection about how to have lower taxes and so on are meaningless if the government falls apart. So before we get started on any other kind of reform, we need to end the fiscal death spiral. And economists feel strongly about this, but it's not made its way. It has no influence today. This lesson is just greeted with a shrug if you talk to any federal politician. Interestingly, the same thing's not true at the state level. Most states are fiscally quite responsible. They still haven't learned that democracy doesn't work. So democracy at the state level works, not even in my state, California, which is most of the time pretty crazy, but even now there's a budget surplus in California, but not in the federal government. So figure it out. Okay, so that's what I have to say, and I think now we're ready for, we have time, right? Yeah, we have plenty of time for any questions they may have. Thanks. You must have a question, Dr. Carlson. Don't you have a question? Come on. Yeah, okay, yes.
Questions? Thank you for that wonderful discussion. I mean, you mentioned one of the things that tax on capital, you were essentially suggesting tax on plants and equipment and intellectual property and things like that. And that has the negative effect on productivity. But we tried several, and we have several iterations of that. For example, the last tax cut. What we saw is in a companies or corporation, they're buying back their own shares.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically creates a situation which is not any tangible effect on labor market or productivity in some way. It's just inflating the asset prices. And so are you saying that we have we should try a good faith attempt? I mean, when in fact we reduce the tax on capital, how are you going to measure who you're going to hold accountable, to get the real return?
Okay, so I think there's been some misunderstanding of this question of buying back shares. A share buyback means that there's an agreement between the shareholders and the company that the capital can be better used by the shareholder for some other purpose than keeping it invested in the company. That it's not a subtraction of capital from the economy. The funds are not leaving the economy. They're not being thrown away. They're in the hands of investors, and those investors will typically then move the finance to some other, what they think is a more productive place. Now, one thing that's very important to understand is that there's a huge structural change going on in U.S. capitalism, which is we're phasing out publicly traded companies. So the buybacks you're talking about are in a publicly traded company. But the publicly traded sector is going down, 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 and the private equity sector is going up, 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 up. Well, naturally, you're seeing a flow of capital out of publicly traded companies, and we can't trace the dollars, but we know that capital is going into privately organized companies. people, I think, are completely unaware of how big the non-publicly traded sector, either private equity, which is now many trillions of dollars, and also another big factor, which is economists have just discovered in the last 6 months, is subchapter S corporations, who can never be publicly traded. They're a quarter of all capital value, a quarter. Here's this whole sector that we knew nothing about, and suddenly we started doing research on subchapter S corporations, and they're gigantic as a factor of total capital. So we've got these two. We've got private equity and subchapter S, and what they have in common is concentrated management. The owners are in very close touch with the managers, which is not true in a publicly traded company. So it looks like capitalism is changing its character, and public markets are having a smaller and smaller role, and it's just a natural thing that's going on. So buybacks, which are exclusively in publicly traded companies, are kind of a natural part of that process. As far as identifying the advantages of the benefits we got from lowering capital taxes in 2017, slightly less than a year ago, it's way too soon to say that we can spot that in the data. So you have to stay tuned on that. But the support in a wide body of economic analysis for the idea that taxes on capital matter is pretty strong. So I'm pretty confident. But obviously, having had a big experiment that was launched 10 months ago, it's too soon to say that it didn't work. It's too soon to say that it did work. We just have to keep looking.
Hi, thank you, Professor Hall, for a very thought-provoking presentation. So my question relates to inequality. So in your presentation, you talk about what happens on average to the average worker. But what about issues of both income inequality, but also, since we're talking about capital taxation, wealth inequality? What are your views on this in terms of, say, people of different levels of education, men and women, the geographic dispersion of economic activity, for instance, and what kind of policies do you think we should implement to target issues of inequality, if we should at all?
Great. It would take another week to answer that question, but so first of all, the U.S. is uniquely a land of opportunity. Now, it turns out that lands of opportunity do sometimes generate some very successful people, and then you see these big increases in inequality. And there's a lot of thinking about this subject of trying to balance getting the most total out of the economy, which calls for giving people strong incentives and maintaining a philosophy of high opportunity. And there does seem to be a trade-off between that and then the amount of inequality that results. A great deal of the inequality you're talking about arises from people who are both lucky and, in some cases, productive. Many living near me and driving real estate prices up to ridiculous levels. And they, on the one hand, they were part of a process that's added a lot to our lives. On the other hand, they show up very strongly in the inequality statistics. So that, if you look across countries, the countries that have said, okay, our policies are going to be mostly toward creating opportunity, like Singapore, then they typically go through at least a phase of higher inequality. But they raise everybody's income. And Singapore is so much better off than, say, China. It's crazy. I mean, it's like 10 times better. The average person in Singapore is about 10 times better than someone in China. So you have to balance the two. And I think, and we continue. You mentioned women. In the labor market, there's a gradual improvement of women relative to men, which has been heartening to see. So I think that we have to keep pressing on these topics, but we really also need to realize that the U.S. has done an awful lot for its people by maintaining its reputation as a land of opportunity. So, and there is a trade-off. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And you see that in tax policy. I mean, one of the things that was accomplished in 2017 that I think got very little recognition is that for once, so we did something about subchapter S corporations to lower their capital tax rates. We were very, very careful not to allow people to pretend that their labor earnings should be taxed under subchapter S. So there was a very carefully articulated system for maintaining higher tax rates on what amount to earnings, and many of these are if you look at the data on subchapter S, they're a lot of them are quite entrepreneurial, and so the design that went into the tax bill has gotten very little credit. In fact, most people have said it's a joke, but there's a lot of language in the bill that is very careful not to give away a low rate on capital to what's really earnings. Yeah. So actually, the last time I gave this talk, that came up, and it was a congressional group, and 2 hands went up. They said, we were the architects of that. We were the committee staffers who actually put all this hard work into these provisions that prevented this arbitrage. And there was a woman said, you're the first economist who's ever given us any credit for it. So I felt very good about that. I wish more people would give them credit for it and it was very attentive to this point. We don't want to lower capital taxes in such a way that unnecessarily give high income people, where the income comes from earnings, something that they don't deserve. So I was very impressed by. I think I'm the only economist who's read that whole parts of that tax bill. It's 2,000 pages, so it's understandable. But anyway, yeah.
I can speak loud here. I have comment and question. First, I will say I am Sylvia Carter, economist. Question I explain. But all your solutions are to see towards increasing the economy, GDP, and increasing the productivity.
Uh-huh.
This method is there for decades and it's not working. And there is no reason why it should work. Let me say this.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I missed that. What is it that's not working?
It cannot go on forever. You see, when we had our child born, he was growing 1 pound a month. And then it reduced. My wife went to the pediatrician. She said, oh, what is the problem? He's not growing now. He said, madam, if he grows 1 pound every month, how many pounds he will be when he's 30 years old? So 360 pounds. You don't want that. So you have to slow down somewhere. So the issue here is another example I can give. Jeff Bezos, his company has grown. He is the richest man, but his labor force, I heard many of them are on, food stamps. So as his company grew, the people working on that. I just learned one word from your talk today, which is very useful. Labor share. The solution is the labor share has to increase, you see. Otherwise, people's wages are not going to increase. And with the demise of unions, labor force has no say anywhere. And capitalistic system, though good in a way, is exploitory in nature. So it exploits the labor and their wages are not. I think, as Sylvia, I think economists should change their mind. It has to be the labor share, it has to increase, not that the GDP or the productivity should increase. As far as this death spiral, there is no death spiral actually. Let me give a simple example. If the federal government needs $100 billion deficit, in Washington DC they print $200 billion. 100 billion they send to the China and other countries, buy the product. 100 billion they circulate in the country US, and those goods and the 100 billion they match, and there is no inflation. So this will continue as long as our currency is reserve currency. Once it is not, then it will be a death spiral.
Okay. Ah,
Hi. Thanks so much for being
I don't-
here today.
I don't think you're on the air.
Hi, thanks so much for being here today. Sorry about that. I broke everything. So, I thought this was incredibly thought-provoking, especially when we look at problematic issues and what that we're talking about, GDP, unemployment, things that are problems. And so what I think about it is how we keep questioning, how do we address these problems, rather than how do we prevent these things from becoming a problem in the first place. So one of the basic things that every economist learns, or every student learns in an econ class, is opportunity cost and what that means. And so in my class, the definition was, it's when an individual gives up something, and perhaps ideally, to gain something more than what they started with. And so what this makes me think of is, it indicates that every individual in our society has had something beforehand so that they can give it up, so that they can benefit some type of way. But then, I want to think about it this way. We expect a lot of individuals in our society to benefit us. And we question, why are these 16-year-olds not working? Why are they not benefiting our economy? Why aren't they going to school? And I think it comes down to this. Our opportunity cost is actually people in our society. People that we give up. And what that means is people that we misallocate. People that we force to go to a 4-year college rather than a 2-year college to get their technical degree. And so I think it all comes down to education and how we start individuals, how we prep students to be capable workers to benefit our economy in the future. Now my question for you is, we're talking about reforms and policies and all of this. I was wondering what expectations you have for these policies that are going to be made for education, and what do you think individuals like myself can benefit the most? How can we better prepare young individuals for the workforce in the future? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I only very briefly mentioned education, but obviously education is totally central. And that compared to other countries, U.S. education is quite unsuccessful. So I think one of the clear focuses of successful education research has been to compare the U.S. to successful countries. The most successful country, does anyone know? Finland. Finland, first of all, Finland breaks every rule practically. It has no school choice. It has exclusively publicly supported education. But the results it gets are so incredibly impressive relative to the US on roughly similar resources. So carefully studying successful education models elsewhere would be a big step forward. And that certainly includes some of the things you mentioned, like channeling or directing students to the kind of education that's going to be, I think that we believe that there's pretty close to a coincidence of individual interests and social interests with respect to education. So we're basically asking people in terms of education to do what's really best for themselves, but that's something that's not happening, and especially in the education that is offered to lower income communities is just woefully behind. No, I think it's the number one priority. It's somewhat outside my area of expertise, so I'm just telling you what I've learned. I have a colleague who is a total specialist on this. I'm mostly, especially what I know about Finland, comes entirely from him. But I think you've certainly touched on a really important topic in terms of getting better performance from the U.S. system.
Thank you, Dr. Hall, for coming in today. Looking at your last slide here with the fiscal debt of the U.S., and for some cases right now, you said, of course, we're not in dire straits yet because the bond market is still open and stuff like that. And in some cases, compared to other world currencies like the euro and the yen, we're in much better shape. But that's because probably we're the world currency right now. So did you do any research with kind of the UK's pound in like the 50s and 60s when they got pulled off of the world standard to be, in which the dollar was placed?
Oh, now you're really getting, it's always been my position that the U.S. economy is so hard to understand, I wouldn't try to understand other economies. So I would defer in general to others, but I guess I could say, I don't think that's absolutely first order. People, I know that there's the accusation that what in the trade craft is called the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. That is, for example, we can borrow in world markets at 1/10 of 1% lower interest rate than, say, Britain, your example, can. I don't think it's that big a deal. It would take some monumental blunder on the part of the U.S., such as being kicked out of the bond market, for us to lose. It's so deeply ingrained that the use of the dollar in international transactions is so deeply ingrained that it's not something that's going to disappear overnight, except if we did have just a complete meltdown, which, as you say, is not going to happen too soon. So it's down my list of worries, let me put it that way. I think that, first of all, it's not that advantageous, and second, I don't think it's going to change anyway.
Any other questions? Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being here. We have a small token of appreciation to you. It certainly isn't enough for all the wonderful knowledge you've shared with us today, but thank you for being here. I want to thank our Department of Economics, who recruited Professor Hall to be here with us. And all of you, there are refreshments still here if you want to mingle and if you want to speak. I'm sure Professor Hall would speak to you personally, but thank you each for being here today. Thank you.